Okay, so this is going to be the video recording regarding Edgar Allan Poe's The Masque of the Red Death. And again, as we've been doing, this will be a review. We will cover some of the ground that we covered in class and touch on a few things that perhaps we didn't spend as much time in class on as we could have, or maybe touch on a few things that we didn't discuss. And as usual, my approach is going to be to put the actual text up on the screen and go through it in a fair amount of detail. Right? So again, some of this will be repetitive in terms of what we covered in class. But I won't go into too much detail with what we covered in class, since, well, we covered it already in class. And as long as you remain attentive in class and are taking notes, again, this should complement that quite well. And again, as a reminder, the actual class recordings, there are technical issues, so that the recordings are not converting into a format that can then be published onto Omnivox. Right? And if that gets resolved, I'll publish the class videos as well. But it's the same problem that I had last semester, and they still have not been able to figure it out and fix it. So keep that in mind, all right, regarding our actual classes. Okay, so let me pull the text up on the screen. We'll get started. And again, I'm going to consistently try to keep these videos relatively short, hour or less, if I can, and just so that you don't have too much to have to watch through. All right. So again, as we discussed in class, as we know from our previous classes as well, every story we look at, the first thing we see is the title, and to really remind you of the importance of being attentive to the title. And as we discussed, when we see here the Masque of the Red Death, right? The spelling of masque alerts us to the kind of mask that's being referred to here. It's not M-A-S-K. And what we come to realize is the masque as an actual type of performance or party, where masks, as in a masquerade, are used. Right? And again, what that alerts us to is that the masque, which will be the party that we're going to see in the story, is a masque of the Red Death. It's not Prospero's masque. It's not the masque of Prospero, the main character. It's the masque of the Red Death. And this can almost suggest that death, the Red Death, the personification of death in the form of the character that arrives during the masque, and of course all the mystery that surrounds how he got in through the welded shut doors of the castle, is the one who actually arranges it, in a sense. Okay, and you have to keep in mind with this story, as in so many of Edgar Allan Poe's stories, in following the Gothic setting, right, adds this air of mystery and otherworldliness, right? And of course, that is further exemplified in the personification of death. And there's a lot of personification happening in this story, right? We see how the clock is described, the black ebony clock is described with human qualities, right? Again, enhancing that very gothic, eerie sense. You'll notice my background that I put on for this particular recording. The moon back there, if you can see over my head, you know, trying to convey that. And it is very much in that genre. Okay, so why the Red Death? And again, we talked about this. More familiar, historically, in any case, is the Black Death, as it was referred to, the Great Plague that ravaged Europe in the Middle Ages. We are dealing with something of equal, if not even more, disturbing qualities insofar as the actual manner in which this death kills people. It's swift, takes half an hour, and the victims are bleeding out of their pores. Again, creating this extraordinarily grotesque imagery, heightening the fear, if you will, of death, right? And, you know, this story, allegorically, symbolically, metaphorically, as we have to look at this story, as we look for in all the stories that we engage with in this class, here it's very much highlighted that we are meant to look at these images that we're presented with symbolically, metaphorically, and allegorically, right? Other stories which have a much more realistic flavor to them, these elements are there as well, but they're not enhanced to the same level as a story such as this, and we're alerted to that pretty much right from the title. And then, of course, the images that we're presented with right at the beginning. And again, reminding you that the first paragraph, 2 paragraphs, beginning of any story, it's so important to be attentive to what is being presented to you, as it lays a foundation from which everything else grows from. Right? And if you have a chance, as I've encouraged you all to, try to read the stories twice. Because when you come back after reading it the first time, you'll be recognizing things as you go through it the second time that will be much more obvious your second time round, because now you've seen how the connections are made throughout the story, demonstrating something that we're presented with early on, which may seem somewhat superficial or not have the kind of depth of meaning that in fact we find out it does have later on in the story by making the connections, and then coming back and having that opportunity to reread, or at least reread the first few paragraphs. Oh, look at this, a kind of foreshadowing, right? Alerting us to something that we want to, even on our first reading, to be attentive to see if it grows, right? If more references we introduce to things, you know, first and foremost, characters, right? We're introduced to a character, we're given some basic information about that character, and we want to see how that basic information then lends itself to what transpires through the rest of the story. But it's also the images we're presented with. What possible symbolic meanings they have may not be clear at the beginning, but become clearer as we proceed, coming back and rereading it, now understanding the symbolic meaning of that image and seeing it back at the beginning can often shape or even transform to some degree the way we are encountering it at the beginning. Okay? It's one of the reasons in terms of these pre-recorded videos that I post, where they're being posted after you've read the story, after we've covered the story in class, giving you the opportunity to reread it with me, at least certain sections of it, and encouraging you, especially when they're short like this, to reread it yourself. And then the information that and the analysis that you're engaged in will become more evident, the conclusions you can draw, and it will resonate deeper in your memory, right? And will also shape, to a large extent, the way that you read in the future, for the next story we're going to read, and for everything you read in the future, in terms of what to be alert to. Like that close reading. Why is this red? Why, as we discussed, and we'll talk a bit about here, why these colors for the room? What are the possible meanings and symbolic implications of a color? And even in this story, that's very evident, right? Our attention is drawn to it in such a way that we cannot avoid asking ourselves, why blue, purple, green, orange, white, violet, black? But sometimes it's much more subtle than that, where we'll have a description in a story of a house, a yellow house with a black door, whatever it may be. We want to ask ourselves, why is the house yellow? What could be the possible meaning of that? I want to be looking to see if the story, as I continue reading, will give me more clues as to the possible significance of the color yellow in terms of a house, or the black color of the door. You may not know that when you first encounter that when you're reading it, but then, later on, I get it, right? First paragraphs, always important, really alerts us, combined with our title, really lays that foundation. The Red Death had long devastated the country. There's our first sentence, right? So it's really setting the tone. It's preparing us for our reading experience. It's telling us what to look for. We have the Red Death, which of course we've already been introduced to in the title. And now that Red Death, we're learning, is devastating. Right? So and of course we're already making certain associations with the Red Death because we can link it up in our minds with the memories of the historical context of the Black Death. Though we may be curious, again, why Red Death? Why not Black Death? What's the significance? But it's meant to conjure up that association with a plague. And of course, in this time with COVID and everything else, that comes to us even quicker. And now the emphasis on the brutality of this particular plague. No pestilence had ever been so fatal or hideous. This is the most devastating plague, this Red Death, ever. So the story's telling us. So the narration is telling us. No pestilence had ever been so fatal. Right? Clearly indicating that we are dealing with something of an enormous magnitude. Blood was its avatar and its seal. And that's why, red, blood, we make that association. It's also alerting us with the emphasis on red, tying red into blood, that making that association with color alerts us to be looking for color symbolism. And of course, we get so much of it in this story. The redness and the horror of blood. And this vivid description here. There were sharp pains and sudden dizziness, and then profuse bleeding at the pores with dissolution. The scarlet stains upon the body, and especially the emphasis here now upon the face of the victim were the pest ban which shut him out from the aid and from the sympathy of his fellow men. It's so hideous and that it's coming out of the face. The emphasis on the face. The narration is telling us that when others were to see the victims of this plague, they wouldn't want to give aid or even have sympathy for their fellow man, fellow men, fellow human, because of how not just disturbing it is, but how dehumanizing it is to some degree. And this is emphasized to us. And note the word sympathy, right? That there will, it forces us not to have sympathy for someone who catches the plague. Now this is important because what do we notice when Prince Prospero gathers up his entourage, his 1,000 friends, and lock themselves in, and at the same time thinking they're locking out the plague, and are able to carry on partying and enjoying this new type of life, but still nonetheless enjoying life, with no sympathy or thought for what's happening outside to their fellow human beings. Right? It's one of the things we notice if we're looking at the character development of Prospero and the revelers. How can they not care about what's happening outside? Right? So this is, we talked about how the story is very much about the inevitability of death. You can't hide from death. You can't shut death out. But it also tells us a bit about the character of this particular group of people. And if we take that from the microcosmic to the macrocosmic, it's a commentary on the human, at times, human propensity to not have sympathy or caring for others. And maybe that's, and what happens to them all at the end is a commentary on perhaps the dangers of not caring for others. Do we as readers feel any sympathy for Prospero at the end? And if we don't, why don't we? In the same way that they are having no sympathy for the people who are dying outside the castle walls. And we're drawn to thinking about that because of the use of the word sympathy here, that it's emphasized to us. And the whole seizure, progress, and termination of the disease were the incidents of half an hour. It's quick. But by giving us that information of how quickly the people, from once they exhibit these symptoms, they die, it's also, and this is something we know when we come back reading it for a second time, it's alerting us to be attentive to the concept of time. We know that not necessarily when we first read it. It's just giving us some basic information about how this disease plays itself out. But once we finish the story, we're certainly very much aware of the importance of the theme of time is in this story. And that ties in with the mentioning of a specific time frame in the opening paragraph. These are the connections that I'm constantly talking about, that we need to be looking for when we read these stories. All right, so we have the setting, and we have a real view, image given to us of, in essence, one of the characters of the story. And you may be saying, well, no, we get that in the next paragraph, right? When we find about Prince Prospero. Well, why am I saying we're introduced to a character here? Well, it's the Masque of the Red Death. The Red Death is this plague, but we know, after having read it already, that the Red Death will be personified in human form. Red Death, in fact, is a character at the end of the story. And is, in fact, a character throughout the story. Right? Through that use of that literary procedure called personification. So this is, in essence, the character study of the personification of the Red Death. And then we're introduced to Prince Prospero. We talked about in class the implications of the name. We always want to be attentive to the names that are given to the characters in the stories that we read. So Prospero, prosperous, which clearly is indicated for us in terms of his opulent lifestyle, is clearly a prince with money, prosperous. But there is that, as in most cases, more than, there are layers of meaning. And Prospero is a character from Shakespeare, from The Tempest, and very much alerts, at least if you're familiar with Shakespeare, that would be something you would take note of. It's not necessary, right? It allows for that layer is there. You can proceed and look at it in that sense. It would be something that would be hard to fully explore and understand the implications in their entirety without reading The Tempest. I haven't asked you to read The Tempest. That's why I'm not spending too much time in discussing the relationship between Prince Prospero and Prospero from The Tempest. I would need to ask you to read The Tempest where that comparison could be made. But those of you who might be familiar with Shakespeare's The Tempest would then be able to pursue that. And that engages in another literary term that is often available to us in these stories, is this idea of intertextuality, where one story, in this case Edgar Allan Poe's story, by referencing another well-known part, a well-known text from the literary canon, if you will, brings, this is the intertextuality, they're joined, brings Shakespeare's Tempest into this story. It makes it a part of the story on some level, if you are going to study it in depth and get to that layer, right, where you would be reading them together and exploring the implications of themes from The Tempest in a new manifestation in the current text. All right? So it could be, and that's layered in itself. It could be just a shout out to a very specific line from the Shakespeare play, or it could be drawing in a whole thematic quality that then is woven through the rest of this story. It's a similar process, and he does this a number of times in this story. We talked a bit about the biblical references, the reference to Thessalonians 1, one of Paul's epistles from the New Testament, and the suggestions that brings into this text as well, giving it that theological dimension, and then the whole implications of that particular letter that Paul wrote. If you are a student or of the Bible, theology or Christianity and so on, and you're familiar with Thessalonians, then you're able to bring the themes from that particular letter of Paul's into this story, because Poe is inviting that by making the reference. There are reference to in here as well to a play by Victor Hugo, right? The Hernani. There is Herod is invoked later on, right? The massacre of the innocents, right? Which in itself then ties in to early Christianity. The connections are all over the place here. And I'm not saying that in any way to overwhelm you, but it's to remind you that when we're reading these stories, especially stories such as this, where we're invited to go into a world of mystery, right? And let's be honest, the biggest mystery of all that's being explored here is the mystery of death. But the way that an artist will weave the fabric of their creation is often in referencing, alluding to, and then drawing those other texts into his or her own text, because they're dealing with these themes such as death, and such as, sympathy for fellow men and all this, which are themes that are explored in these other texts from other angles. So we get almost a kaleidoscope of views. So yes, we looked at it in class, pretty much from one lens, one telescope, if you will, that mainly of Edgar Allan Poe on its most obvious level, right? And then we broke that down, and when it comes to symbolism, takes that singular telescopic view, if you will, and breaks it down, starts the kaleidoscope development. Symbolism, allegory, personification, it's all becoming now multifaceted, right? And as we discovered in class when we were discussing it, we see these different levels. We have this kaleidoscopic effect. Well, then, just to let you know that when you start bringing in all the allusions and references and so on, then that becomes doubled, tripled, quadrupled in terms of that kaleidoscopic effect. All exploring the same themes, but demonstrating the difficulty in understanding these themes in any kind of absolute way. And through art, theology, philosophy, all things contained in literature, we try to explore it from as many angles as we can to try to get a greater grasp, a better understanding of death, human interrelations, human behavior, human consciousness, and ultimately, as I've said many times, to come back to having a better understanding of ourselves. All right. So it's already a half hour in. So I'm going to move fairly quickly now. But this, what I just covered here, and this is being recorded, so you can come back and listen to it again, and certainly bring it up in class if you're sitting going, what is he talking about? All right. And we don't have time to, we could study this particular story for 3, 4, 5 weeks by bringing in all the alluded to texts and seeing how they work in tangent with this text. project for another course, right? But you should be aware that it's there. I mean, even something like the Gothic, once we understand that this is a Gothic text, the genre is Gothic, right? We're alerted to that, not just because it says Gothic window here, right? But the whole setting lends itself to the Gothic coming from, initially a style, right? But we would be looking at it very specifically of the Gothic style as the Gothic style pertains not to Gothic architecture. That's part of it, right? That's what he means by a Gothic window. But the Gothic genre in literature. And again, that's a whole study into itself. The university offers courses on Gothic literature. But nonetheless, it does open other avenues. What does engaging as a writer, as an artist, engaging the Gothic style, what does that suggest? And does that shape the way we as readers are going to look at things? Absolutely. But it can't be solely dependent on that. If this story was dependent upon an audience being totally familiar with Shakespeare and The Tempest and Victor Hugo's plays and the Bible and everything that concerns the Gothic style, and if this story can't function unless there is a great familiarity with all these other references, then the story is a failure. These are added levels. But as you should certainly be aware of by now, if you weren't before, it also works on its own level. And we're approaching it from initially that first level of comprehension. But it is important to be aware of the other levels that they're there, so you can look for them. So when you see a reference to Hernani or the Herod, which is an obvious reference, you could be, if you had time, and always suggested on my part, then track it down and at least get a taste of it and realize that those options are also there. All right, this is the whole intertextual component. And we'll look at it in other texts that we explored. Sometimes it can be done from an historical. We get a similar element of that, quite honestly, since we're on the subject, when we look at the Red Death, right? To make the association with the Black Death, to make that association of the plague, the Great Plague that ravaged Europe. That brings that into the discussion as well. Ideally, we would run after that and learn everything there is to learn about the Great Plague and see how this text is playing off of that. As I've said, I don't think in this class, but certainly in many of the classes that I've taught, ideally, we'd all be able to just plug into the Matrix. If you're familiar with the movie, they can put in a program, and in a matter of seconds, all the information about that subject is absorbed into your brain. Right? If you remember, Trinity needs to know how to fly a helicopter. I need it now. 10 seconds later, she's able to fly the helicopter. So we'd be able to do that here, and in 10 seconds, we know everything there is to know about the Bible, everything there is to know about the plague, and then be able to apply it to the story. But of course, the real reality of it is, no, we can only do that if we're willing to put in the effort and to follow that through. Then, certainly, if you go on to study English literature at university and graduate school and so on, that's what you do. Okay, back to the text specifically, and again, try to move a little quicker here. So we know Prospero is introduced, and again, it works just on the level of prosperous. Doesn't have to go, to Shakespeare. But it can. And what do we find out about Prospero? We get this emphasis, and this is where I've always encouraged you to be very attentive to, the language, the words that are being used. He summoned to his presence a thousand hale and light-hearted friends from among the knights and the dames of his court. So again, since obviously I can't go through the whole text in this kind of detail because I'd be here for 5 or 6 hours. You wouldn't want to have to sit through that. But to demonstrate how you should be reading, what you want to take note of here, yes, it's 1,000 that he will be inviting, right, to his attempt to escape death, right? But that they are lighthearted, and that they are among knights and dames, so the elevated class. It tells us a lot just there, and that they're lighthearted, meaning a little bit frivolous, right? Not deep thinkers, and we certainly get that sense in so far as that they are willing to just try to forget about everything, try to forget about what's going on with the Red Death that's ravaging the country, ravaging their world, and to in bringing it down to a more universal, recognizable quality, just the frivolousness concerning the concept of death in itself, whether it's the Red Death or the plague or whatnot. But just as we see once we get into the castle, it is just the concept of death ultimately that this is exploring, one of the main themes that it's exploring, and the fear of death and the attempt, not just by Prospero and his 1,000 friends, but to a large extent all of us, to find ways to go on with our lives without becoming overwhelmed by the fear of death, the fear of the inevitability of death, as we go through the stages of life, right? That brings us back here again. And this I won't go into great detail because we spent a lot of time on this, of the colors and how they can represent on the way that we were reading it as one possible way of reading the significance and symbolism of these 7 rooms and the colors that are associated with it. And how, again, we have a very specific here, the Red Death, Prince Prospero, the castle, but ultimately it's talking about a much bigger picture, a universal picture, and commentary on, the human relationship with the understanding, or should I say lack of understanding, of death. Right? And its inevitability, that you can't escape it. Running around to come up behind you again. I can go back to my Pink Floyd reference. And of course, we get that emphasized through, as a work of literature, a work of art, through other symbols which are connected to the symbols that we meet along the way. They're all interconnected on some degree. So we have the ebony clock. We have the ebony clock, we have it in terms of its color. We have the significance of a clock as a representative of time, right? Which brings us back to that half hour over here. We have the ebony clock here. We have a personification, right, of the clock. It was in this apartment also that there stood against the western wall. So remember, we talked about east to west. We're in the final room. And in this room, a gigantic clock of ebony Its pendulum swung to and fro with a dull, heavy, monotonous clang. Bong, bong, monotonous, repetitive, boring. Boring only insofar as it is, and boring probably isn't the right word. It's just there. And when the minute hand made the circuit of the face, and the hour was to be stricken, great word, stricken, strike it down. When he dies, when struck down. There came from the brazen lungs of the clock. A clock has lungs? That's personification. It's giving a human, an animal in any case, but a human lungs to the clock. Brings the clock into the realm of something that's alive. As if the clock is speaking to everyone. And then we remember how they react when the clock rings. Everything stops. And since we've been introduced to this idea of this human animal quality of the clock, the fear that the clock is generating, right, impacts human beings in a specific way. On the one hand, it's just a man-made device that is making a noise. It's like anything else, but its symbolic meaning, I mean, we get it in any context with a clock signifying time. In this context of this story, right, where we know death is involved, and then we have as well the color black associated with the clock in the final of the 7 rooms, all the way in the west where the sun sets. Time then becomes closely associated with death, and the sound is almost like presented to us as a voice, right? So the clang of the clock, which has everyone stop and then nervously start up again, is a voice. Yes, it's speaking directly to the 1,000 revelers at the Masque, but it's also speaking to, on a universal level, as a voice that is shouting out, hey, everybody, y'all having a good time? Enjoy it while you can. Carpe diem, seize the day. Because time, as I am directly connected with the inevitability of the passage of time, which then has the inevitable relationship with the end of time. I am located here at the end of these rooms, the end of time, the end of existence, death. And you go on about your lives and you don't think much about me, and I don't blame you, because you don't know what is in store for you after that. But I'm reminding you. It's just a clock though, right? And it talks about here, right? Just to show you how it's presented in the actual words of our text here. Brazen lungs of the clock, a sound which was clear and loud and deep and exceedingly musical, but of so peculiar a note and emphasis that at each lapse of an hour, every time this clock clanged, every time this voice with these lungs shouted out, the musicians of the orchestra were constrained to pause momentarily in their performance and to hearken to the sound. And thus the waltzers, the dancers, the revelers, perforce ceased They're evolutions. It's very, Poe's language. They're evolutions of dance. They're waltzing. And there was a brief disconcert of the whole gay company. And while the chimes of the clock yet rang, while it is clanging, it was observed that the giddiest, happiest, I'm having fun, I'm at a party, grew pale, and the more aged and sedate, those who are older, closer to death, passed their hands over their brows as if in confused reverie or meditation. And it's noteworthy because we get a sense from these revelers and Prince Prospero, they seem so nonchalant and uncaring and unsympathetic and brazen, seemingly fearless, because they have a sense of security, because they're locked in, seemingly locked away from the Red Death, locked away from life. If you're locked away from death, you're locked away from life. But they can't escape it completely. They're trying, but they're failing. The commentary there is no matter what you do to try to get away from it, you can't. And even if you don't fully understand why you're feeling this every time the clock goes, it's just because you're not aware. Remember the biblical quote, like a thief in the night. It can sneak up on you like a thief in the night because you're not being attentive. And if you are suddenly, what is that? Why am I feeling this? I hear that clock striking. It's not enough just to, what's that? Why? And then you can become prepared for when death arrives at your masquerade party and says it's time. And then you can say, well, I knew you'd be getting here at some point. Rather than responding the way Prospero responds. That, again, comes back to what I was discussing earlier in terms of an allusion to that particular line from the epistle, one of the epistles by Paul, and the significance of that. And of course, coming back to what I was saying earlier, then you could run with Paul. And it's inviting you to. And get into the whole theological discussion of Paul's epistles in relation to death and the hereafter, and the relationship it all has to the basic theological tenets of that time. Okay. The rest of this, again, it's just to remind you of what, and again, I don't want to be too repetitive from what we did in class, because you were all there and you were all paying attention and taking notes. We do get more, and it's another area to keep in mind when we look at the only character other than the character of the Red Death, perhaps the character of the Ebony Clock. But the only, clearly defined human character is Prospero, and we do learn a fair amount about him, and a lot of it is commentary on arrogance, elitist mentality, and there certainly is a commentary there, right? Again, comes back to what I was saying earlier, the lack of sympathy for others, and the idea of just, go out and have a good time, and don't think about other things. The tastes of the Duke were peculiar, though, and that adds to the Gothic feel. We certainly get the impression he's a bit of a strange man. It's strange, though, in what way? Is open to different interpretations. Yes, he's bizarre. There is this, well, let's read it here. He had a fine eye for colors. Well, really, no kidding. And effects, really. The rooms, remember how they're set up? There's no actual lights. There's these braziers with the fire that reflects. We have the stained glass windows, which cast that eerie look. And, you know, this is very much by design in terms of the decor of this castle by Prospero. There is a lot there to explore as well in terms of the Shakespearean character Prospero as well. Again, we don't have time to delve into that. He had a fine eye for colors and effects. He disregarded the decora of mere fashion. His plans were bold and fiery, and his conceptions glowed with barbaric luster. Barbaric luster. Barbarian, outside of usually the idea. I mean, explore, you know, what constitutes a barbarian, or what was perceived to be barbaric behavior. It usually has an association with a lack of cultural refinery, if you will. Of course, there's much more to it than that. If we trace the roots of where the term comes from and who were perceived and what the barbarians actually were. But in this context, it is barbaric in relation to what would have been perceived and conceived of at the time as, you know, more proper. There are some who would have thought him mad. That's how outlandish he is. And we certainly can sit here and say to ourselves, I can, yeah, guy actually is sealing himself in with his 1,000 revelers and sealing everyone else out, and kind of thinks that he's just going to live for eternity in this world. It sounds a bit insane to me too. His followers felt that he was not. Now we're getting into an almost cultish reverence that these 1,000 people may have for him. You know, to completely shut yourself out from the rest of society and everything that society and culture bring to human existence within a community. This is a community within itself, led by someone who's described as barbaric or even mad in terms of the normal understanding of that culture and community and society, but not necessarily, in this case, his followers felt that he was not. It was necessary to hear and see and touch him to be sure that he was not. So there's almost this level of worship that these people have for Prospero. Almost as if we wanted to take it and then draw it into that theological context which is available to us, but even not going that deep into that, we can also see it in terms of, okay, we are shut out from our community and our culture, and that includes, you know, leaderships and theology and all this. So the need to feel that this is the right thing to have done, they turn to him, to Prospero. And Prospero seems to take on that role, if you will, of a type of cult leader, political leader, religious leader, that is being worshipped in some capacity. And the need to trust in Prospero, because if we don't trust in Prospero, then we may have doubts as to whether or not we did the right thing by locking ourselves in this castle with him. We get again the emphasis on the Gothic, the grotesque. Hernani is that reference to a Victor Hugo play that I mentioned earlier. Again, no need to track that down, only if you wanted to. I don't want to make things more confusing than is necessary. There were delirious fancies such as the madman fashions. There were much of the beautiful, much of the wanton, much of the bizarre, something of the terrible, and not a little of that which might have excited disgust. Right? There's a sense of debauchery here, right? There's where it's conjuring up, you know, the wildness of the party, but it's taking it even further. And you know, this, we know we're in a mask, where it's a masquerade, and what that conjures up as well is disguises. No one knows who's who. Bizarre, terrible, disgusting, to and fro in the seven chambers they're stalked, in fact, a multitude, and do note here, you know, of dreams. So now we're getting a dream-like quality, even suggesting to us that, or reminding us, this isn't real. All these elements that we are, images that we're being introduced to, are built up to from the wanton, bizarre, terrible, disgusting, to a dreamlike quality. And there's a tremendous amount of suggestion in that as well. If we look at dreamlike quality in relation to death. But think of the garden party and her reaction when she sees the dead body, and goes on about him dreaming, which is a shout out, you know, and I'm not saying that's necessarily here, but if we make those connections to the garden party and so on, as I point out when we talk about the garden party, the idea of dream and death is a shout out to Hamlet, perchance to dream, right, from his famous soliloquy, Shakespeare's Hamlet. You know, the dreamlike quality, which dreams being so bizarre and being so difficult to understand and get a grasp on, as is the questioning and wondering about death. And the wild music of the orchestra seem as an echo of their steps, and anon there strikes the end back to the ebony clock. All right. Then we have, again, I'm going to just finish up now. We have just up here, and thus too it happened, perhaps, that before the last echoes of the last chime had utterly sunk into silence, there were many individuals in the crowd who had found leisure to become aware of the presence of a masked figure which had arrested the attention of no single individual before. Who's this? And the rumor of this new presence having spread itself whisperingly around, there arose at length from the whole company a buzz or murmur expressive of disapprobation and surprise. And then finally of terror, horror, and disgust. Terror, horror, and disgust. What are they seeing? Who's this masked figure? This new presence? It's death. All right, and we know what happens next. We talked about it in class. There's the confrontation. Remember how they pass, right? They chase from the east to the west through each room, each stage of life. Remind you of how we went into detail about the blue, purple, green, orange, white, violet, black, different stages in life, culminating in the final room in the west. in the room of death, where they chase this new presence, this masked figure, the personification of death. And ultimately, and we know there's more levels, but in the most obvious level is the inability to escape from death. And a commentary on the arrogance of anyone who thinks they can. Okay, so I'll wrap it up here. Again, trying to keep it a manageable hour. We are reading the chrysanthemums for next class. Very different again, going back to something a little more familiar, realistic, I suppose. So be sure that you have that read for our next class, and we will discuss from there. Let's see you all on Monday.